I would like to talk about corruption, social engineering, and government capture, because this is something that I think is more and more present in some of the problems we're facing in society. And to do this, I would like to discuss a book called Bad Pharma, which is basically a critique of the pharmaceutical industry. Because there's a chapter in this book that does a phenomenal job of describing the social engineering process at play. Now, it's actually been a while since I've read this book, so this isn't a book review per se. I would need to revisit the book to actually do an accurate analysis of the book. I'm just trying to describe, how does social engineering work? How can large corporations capture government regulators? And I'm going to pull examples that come from that book. So I want to give credit where credit is due. I'm going to talk about 4 strategies that large, powerful corporations can use to socially engineer people in the government. And then I'm going to talk about features of our society that makes this more likely in the modern age. Now, the first strategy is to use upward mobility in an industry as both a carrot and a stick for people's career. Basically, in this book, Bad Pharma, Ben Goldacre is talking about how many ways of manipulating data, manipulating information, hiding negative, harmful side effects of drugs, getting through drugs without full information about who should and shouldn't use the drug. The whole book is actually about all of the different mechanisms for manipulating the science to achieve the goals of the market. That's the bulk of the book. There's just this one little part of the book that talks about how is it possible that the regulators allow this kind of stuff to happen. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. If there are regulators inside the government whose job should be to not allow this kind of manipulation of science to actually harm people, then why are those regulators not catching all of this stuff? And one of the cases he makes is that these regulators see people like themselves in those drug companies, and they know if they're nice to the drug companies, if they don't piss off the drug companies, they might have the potential to move up in the industry by getting one of those lucrative drug company positions where basically the people inside the drug companies, they have the same job, they do the same thing, they have the same expertise as the regulators. It's just that those people have way higher social status. They make a lot more money. They are a lot more important in terms of getting invited to give talks in universities and their prestige. The government regulators have a government job and it doesn't make nearly as much. So if those regulators want those jobs for the future, if they want to keep that option open, they need to make sure that they're regulating in a way that isn't going to upset the drug companies too much. So I'm framing that as both a carrot and a stick, because the carrot is seeing people with the same job inside a drug company that are just making a lot more money than the regulators in the government. So that's the carrot. The stick is basically if you go against the will of the drug company too much, that's going to cut off opportunities for career advancement for you. Now, the second strategy that drug companies can use to make sure the regulators are allowing certain things to pass is that the drug companies can use social networks. So if you think about the 100 people that you know best, that you're most likely to see at parties, that you like and are friends with and want to be on good terms with, if you can get someone's circle of 100 favorite people to believe one way, then there's a high social cost to going against that, particularly if it's going to shame or upset or potentially harm in a career way someone in your network. And Goldacre points out that these people who are experts in drugs, experts in the chemistry, the biology, all of those areas of expertise, that's actually a fairly small group of people. It's people with PhDs from top universities. And let me give you a sense for how small that group is. I'm going to talk from my experience. I'm an economist, not a chemist, not a biologist. I'm a healthcare economist, but the question I want to ask here is, how many PhD students do you think graduate in a year from the top programs in chemistry, in biology, and in economics? My cohort of economics PhD students at Berkeley was 35 students. Like, I know those students well. I've seen them drunk, I've seen them sober, I've developed pretty good friendships with a lot of them. So if this is true of chemistry programs that are the top graduating chemistry programs, if it's true of biology and bioengineering programs, then the social engineering problem becomes a lot more manageable for these drug companies to solve, right? It's basically much, much easier to influence how a small group of people think than it is to influence how a large group of people think. It's that simple. I also want to point out an incentive here, which is that the drug companies actually have an incentive to make sure that prestige is really important, that graduating from one of the top 5 programs in chemistry is really important. Because if you can limit the pool of people who will work in the government in those top positions to those 5 programs, and if you can make sure you have enough people that you've recruited from those top 5 programs inside the drug companies, then the social circles are the same. So there's going to be a strong incentive to make sure you're not prestigious unless you're in these top 5, to make sure the regulators who are hiring new graduates also believe that, and to keep the power concentrated both in the government and in the corporations, and that's the same social circle. The third strategy that I think is going on for this social engineering process is to pit people's interpersonal values against their system integrity values. So by interpersonal values, I mean you don't shame someone that you like and that you respect. Don't betray a friend. Don't do anything that will harm a friend's career trajectory. Don't question your friends' belief systems too much. Don't spend too much time critiquing your friends. All of those interpersonal values that are important in keeping a community smooth and well-functioning, those values can be in conflict with values related to the system integrity. And if you think about system integrity when it comes to regulating, when it comes to transparency, all of these values that make government regulators do their job well, those values are actually kind of boring. The system integrity kinds of things involve checking the numbers really carefully. They involve speaking up if you see something that seems suspicious, even if that speaking up is going to cast doubt on a colleague. The system integrity values mean not letting things through unless you believe they're solid. And all of those are kind of boring values. Like, they don't feel like they're interpersonal. They don't feel connected to human beings. Now, they are connected to human beings because a well-functioning system with the regulators who are not captured is actually very protective of the population. But the values of keeping the system with integrity is so far removed from the people who are actually helped by the integrity of the system that it's easy to let the system integrity values have a much lower importance than the interpersonal values that this social group is trying to keep up. The fourth strategy that I think companies can use for socially engineering regulators is to utilize the do-gooder self-image to their advantage. And this one is a little bit hard to explain. So first of all, I want to point out that a lot of this has to do with discussion of costs and benefits of certain things and discussion of the truth or falsehood of different types of information. And anytime you're discussing information, the conversation is going to have a lot of motives at play. There's curiosity, there's integrity, there's social status, there's self-esteem, there's financial incentives. All of these incentives are sort of part of the story in any given conversation about costs and benefits and truth and falsehood. So this point I'm making is about the self-esteem portion of this. And to think this through, I want to give a case, which is a case where a drug has been tested. The initial results are positive. You send this to regulators, and maybe the regulators give it the check to sort of go out to a bigger share of the population. And like with any scientific endeavor, more data continues to come through the doors. So it could be that future data actually shows, wait a second, this drug is harmful. Here's the problem with that. For a regulator to believe that drug is harmful, they would have to believe that they have harmed many, many people. And that is a tough pill to swallow. The fact that your actions that seem really small, like putting the rubber stamp on something to go to market, that could affect many, many people. And if you end up affecting people in a negative way, that's just psychologically going to be hard to deal with. In some ways, this is one of the dilemmas associated with having power, which is that even the small decisions you make have a huge impact. And coming to terms with the negative impacts that you're going to have based on that power is something most people can't handle. So most people just don't look at the evidence of the negative things their decisions have caused and sort of hype up the salience of the positive impacts their decisions have had. But of course, it's a type of human nature that distorts reality because, of course, the negative impacts of your decisions, those are the things that leaders should be paying the most attention to. And in a lot of ways, a lot of corruption is this exact force. It's the force where you stop paying attention to the negative impacts of your decisions. You discount everyone who says there's a negative impact because you can't accept the psychological impact on your psyche. So drug companies could actually use this. And as a matter of fact, it's going to be a natural fit for the scientists inside the drug company, because the scientists want to believe that their drugs are doing great things. So emphasizing the positive, how heroic these scientists are, and de-emphasizing the negative, the harmful effects, is going to be natural for the people inside the drug companies. In which case, you can just transfer that over to the way you speak to regulators in a way that might actually show that, oh yes, the regulators are doing such good work by only letting good things through and keeping bad things out. The regulators are the heroes by letting things into the population that make the regulators heroic, and the things that make the regulators less heroic, just don't talk about those as much. Reduce the salience of the harmful effects. So that mechanism, as a psychological mechanism, as a social mechanism, in some ways as a natural mechanism for the way the psychology of people at the top works, that's also a way for people inside big industries to capture government. And of course, I'm not just talking about drug companies here. I'm actually way more worried about tech monopolies and some of these large companies that have other types of power. But Ben Goldacre, I think, did a great job of explaining this in his book, so that's why I'm using his examples. Finally, I just want to talk about the traits of modern society that make this more likely. The first trait of society that is going to make this more likely is the separation between classes, where if you have a class of people like the working class that rarely interacts with people in power, but experiences a lot of the negative consequences of people in power, the separation of those two groups such that there's not good communication channels across those groups is going to make this much, much easier for the large corporations to convince regulators that this is in everybody's best interest, including the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. The second thing that's going to make this more likely is just the power of the large monopolies. The fact that these huge monopolies control social media, they control means of production, they have a lot of control over, upward mobility for people with certain graduate degrees. They have a lot of power in general. So the more power you have, the easier it is to get more power. And this is just one way that these companies can use their power, is to influence people inside the government for regulatory capture. The third thing in modern society that makes this more likely is the mobility between jobs. And I'm not saying this is a bad feature of society, I'm just saying this will make this thing more likely, because people know that throughout their careers they may want to move between jobs to move up in an industry. And this means that if you are a government regulator, there is a good chance that you're going to have an opportunity to move between jobs. A mobile workforce is just how things work. So you need to be paying attention to the interests of every organization that's a potential future employer. That's just a good economic strategy for you. And what that means is that there could be these naturally collusive forces anytime there's people at the top who all graduate from the same set of universities. And then the fourth trait is the economic incentives in place to collude, both within industries, but also across industries. And I have a video explaining this, which I'll link to below. But the basic idea is that there's incentives for the people who vote on the board of directors for many different companies to raise the economic power of the entire corporate structure. It's basically who's voting people onto the board of directors. It's people who are representing your 401k plan, right? And they don't just care about one company in an industry, they care about everywhere where their money is invested. And because people's portfolios are invested in diverse places, there's going to be incentives for these decision makers to make decisions that benefit the entire corporate ecosystem. So I think that's all I'll say about this. I highly recommend the whole book, Big Pharma, if you want to understand some of these issues. There's a particular chapter in there that talks more about this. But this is something I think we all need to be thinking about when we think about what are the power structures at play? Why does it seem like corporations have so much interest and so much power, even power over government? And if we know these things, we can start to think about, okay, what do we do to break up this power?